Hey everybody, as promised, in this video lecture I want to talk about what happens after the Louisiana Purchase. And I think the best way to do this is to get a little context on the purchase itself. I told you last time that Jefferson becomes president of the United States in 1800, and he would take office, I guess, in 1801. Within 2 years, he has the opportunity to buy this big chunk of land. How does that happen? First, let's dig into this a little bit. It's really a fascinating story, a very complex story, and in the end, it's all because of the mighty mosquito, as we'll see. And I'll explain myself as we go. Back in the 1790s, in Haiti, down in the Caribbean, which was owned, I guess, by France, there was a massive slave rebellion led by Toussaint Louverture. I have images here. He's on the far side, of course. Toussaint Louverture led a wide-scale, bloody slave rebellion in late 1790s Haiti against French officials, against French plantation owners, killing hundreds and pushing the rest out, basically. It was the beginning of a successful slave insurrection on the island. By the time that Napoleon took over in France, in the very late 1790s into the early 1800s, Napoleon decided he wanted Haiti back. And so he organized a French force in 1800 and sent it to Haiti to get the island back. And this was led at first by this guy, French General Charles Leclerc, who brought over initially 12,000 men to Haiti, and eventually more than that would come over, like 25,000 total, to basically stop the rebellion, restore law and order and a plantation system in Haiti, and begin and get back this moneymaker for Napoleon. Napoleon needed a lot of money and supplies in order to conquer the world, as he saw it, the European world, and Haiti was a great place. I mean, they produced a ton of sugar, literally, tons of sugar, sugar cane plantations, coffee was a big deal in Haiti at the time, all these cash crops, and so Leclerc goes over with highly trained veteran French troops who had fought successfully in the Napoleonic Wars in Europe and in Egypt and other places. And he lands in Haiti and begins an attempt to crush Louverture and the rebellious slaves there. At first, things go okay for the French. Leclerc wins a few battles. If they ever go toe-to-toe against the former slave, the Haitian rebels, the French are going to win almost every time. These are trained, well-equipped soldiers going up against people without training or equipment. But eventually, within a few months after Leclerc and his men arrive, they begin to suffer dearly, not at the hands necessarily of the slave, the rebels, but instead by the stingers of these things, right? These horrible mosquitoes that we all know and hate. This specific brand type of mosquito is the Aedes aegypti, the same one that spreads, I think, the Zika virus. That's a big concern right now. It also spread yellow fever, and yellow fever carried by these mosquitoes wiped out the French army. It also led to tremendous suffering among the slaves, but they dealt with it. The French army only had a finite number of guys, at their height, about 25,000, 27,000. And a huge chunk of them died by these little things. These little buggers spread yellow fever, wiping them out. Of the roughly 27,000 total French troops sent over a period of a couple years to fight with Leclerc against Louverture and the rebellious slaves, of the 27,000, 17,000 died of yellow fever. 17,000 died of yellow fever. That's well over half. It's amazing. These mosquitoes did it. This mosquito the Aedes aegypti and the disease it carried was the most powerful ally that Overture and the rebellious slaves could have ever hoped for. Eventually, Leclerc himself caught yellow fever and died in Haiti, and the survivors were forced to leave once again. Unfortunately, Overture was captured by the French and later died in prison. But he's the one who started, and he led successfully this rebellion, and eventually, as you know, Leclerc died and most of the French soldiers died, and Napoleon had to give up on Haiti. Napoleon famously, it is thought, there's some people question exactly how he said it, but he famously said, "Damn sugar, damn coffee, damn colonies," when he heard about Leclerc's death and the failure of the French to take Haiti back. In other words, he said it in French, and I should have said it in French if I could speak French. In other words, Napoleon was frustrated, he was angry at the situation, and he had just recently acquired this huge chunk of land known as the Louisiana Territory from Spain, who he had taken over in his conquest. And since he couldn't get Haiti back, and he was totally focused on what was happening in Europe in his own campaigns, he needed some quick money. He was pissed off, basically, and he rants and raves only as Napoleon could do, and decides in 1803 to just sell the whole lot. He doesn't have Haiti to sell, obviously, but he does have this chunk of land out here. He needed quick cash. He needed money to maintain his armies and continue his campaigns. So he offers Louisiana up for sale to Jefferson and the Americans for a cool $15 million. That's it. That's nothing. That's $15 million in 1803 money, but still, it's dirt cheap for this amount of land. Check out that area, right? and imagine everything that's in there. And this includes New Orleans. Jefferson had only hoped that maybe he could get New Orleans and part of the lower Mississippi. He never dreamed that he could actually get this whole huge chunk of land, essentially doubling the size of the then United States. But Napoleon offers it to him, and before Napoleon changes his mind, Jefferson says, absolutely, we'll take it. Writes a check, and suddenly we have the Louisiana Purchase, and the United States doubles in size. All thanks to the mosquito. Interesting how environmental issues shape the course of history. And in this case, mosquitoes, an environmental, natural phenomenon, of course, with the disease that they carry, shape the course of American history in powerful ways. Right? So there we go. What next? Well, I want to talk a little bit about in this unit. You're going to read a lot about politics and so on, but I want to focus on exploration in lecture. I'm fascinated by, as many people are, fascinated by the Lewis and Clark expedition, for example. And I think it's a good way to get a sense for what Jefferson was thinking and what America was thinking in terms of its future and the land and the purchase and so on. The bottom line is, though, Jefferson just bought this huge chunk of land, and he simply wanted to know what was out there. We had no idea. We knew what was going on around New Orleans. We knew what was happening up and down the lower Mississippi River. But beyond that, if you go north of present-day Missouri, Nebraska, that area, that was a blank spot on the map for us. No European really knew what was out there. There had been a few French fur traders who had ventured out into the Great Plains and Wyoming and that area, but very few. And they didn't write much down and didn't stay very long. So Jefferson immediately sets about putting together an expedition known as the Corps of Discovery to explore this new purchase and to go beyond the purchase. Actually, the Louisiana Purchase was only it stopped around what is now western Montana and Idaho, and Jefferson wanted these guys this expedition to go all the way to the Pacific Ocean, regardless of the map. So he finds the first guy to lead the expedition. he taps one of his advisors, basically, at the White House, Meriwether Lewis. This guy here. Lewis was a good friend of Jefferson, had advised him helped him in his first few years as president. Jefferson trusted him, and Lewis had a mind for organization. He was a scientific-oriented kind of guy, just like Jefferson was. He was interested in the stars and in biology, flora and fauna, plants and animals, and mapping, and all these eclectic things, very much like Jefferson himself. And so he was a natural choice. So Meriwether Lewis was made leader of the expedition, and Lewis decides to find somebody to help him lead the expedition. He didn't want to do it all by himself. And he calls up, sort of, not really calls, but he writes to an old friend he knew who was an army man who had a fairly well-known and respected name in the frontier of America, William Clark. As you might remember, William Clark is the younger brother of the famous Revolutionary War hero, George Rogers Clark. The Clarks were, again, very well known, very respected, very famous, and William Clark was no exception to that. And William had already proven himself in Indian fighting and surveying and all these kind of things. He was sort of the rough soldier type guy to lead the men, whereas Lewis was more of the thinker, the scientific-minded leader. It was a perfect pair. And they liked each other. These guys were friends anyway, which helps. So they become captains. They're made captains in the military, and they're going to lead this expedition to the west. They set about, in 1803, Lewis and Clark, finding the best people to accompany them. Clark especially will write to and recruit many of his former soldiers and mountain men type friends, rough and tumble guys who he knew could survive the journey and provide and prove useful as hunters and so on, explorers to the west. And so they put together this group. The core group of the Corps of Discovery being CORPS, just a military term. The core group consisted of exactly 33 men and one woman, Sacagawea, more often known as Sacagawea, but I think the proper pronunciation is Sacagawea, and a dog, and a slave. These guys would go all the way out to the Pacific and back. There was another group of guys who helped the core group, Lewis and Clark and those 33 men and Sacagawea, up the Missouri River. You can see on the far side, they go all the way up the Missouri River to roughly around modern-day South Dakota, North Dakota for their first winter camp. There was a group of guys who helped them paddle and pull upriver, up the stiff currents of the Missouri River to get to that point. And then they left and let the core group go all the way out to the Pacific. All right. So before we get into the journey itself, what did Jefferson want them to do? What was their exact mission? Jefferson's orders to the Corps of Discovery, to Lewis and Clark. Number one, he wanted them to see, literally, if there was an all-water route, or nearly so, a nearly all-water route to the Pacific Ocean. This is something that explorers, French, British, Spanish explorers have been looking for since the 1500s. And Jefferson and everybody else, really, for that matter, they weren't really certain that there wasn't. There could be a river that cut across America to the Pacific. And if that was the case, that would prove huge for commerce in the Pacific Ocean. Maybe, Jefferson thought, the Missouri River went all the way up and connected, or nearly connected, with another river that went back down to the Pacific Ocean. That was his thinking. Perhaps that's the case. Nobody knew that there was a massive mountain range called the Rocky Mountains, later, standing in the way. But they'll find out soon enough. So number one, see if there's an all-water route. Number two, this is important. Study carefully and record all the flora and fauna, the plants and animals in the new territory. And do so as thoroughly as possible. Jefferson, as you know, was very interested and curious about science and so on, and he made this a direct order. One of the most important orders given to Lewis and Clark was to keep rigorous, detailed journals in which they write about, in as much scientific detail as possible, everything they encounter that was new. Animals, plants, fish, whatever. And they do this, and it's really cool if you read their journals, which are all available for free online through, I'll post a link. I'll try to remember to post a link. The University of Nebraska Press, I think, has all their journals. It's a website. Okay, that was number 2. Number 3, this one's an obvious one, but Jefferson tells them to map the entire area. Everything that they see, everything they encounter must be mapped out and in detail. Every river, every creek, every mountain range, every hill, any kind of noticeable terrain feature, put it on a map. Number 4, this is important, judge the region's potential for economic growth and other economic pursuits, like mining, for example, farming, the fur trade, and so on. Naturally, we already know this, that Lewis and Clark are going to find a lot of potential for mining out there, gold, silver deposits, and so on, as well as potential for fur trade. The mountain men would go out and trap beaver and so on, following Lewis and Clark. And also, and this is the last big thing, but it's important too, number 5, if you're counting, maintain and create diplomatic ties and relations with the Native Americans. Not to mention write about them in as much detail as possible. Because Lewis and Clark are going to encounter some Native Americans who had never directly really seen or talked with Euro-Americans, or any Europeans for that matter, as late as the 1800s, which is hard to believe. And that's another fascinating contour of their journals, as these first encounters with the natives. Okay, so those are their orders, basically. And they set off in, mostly in 1804 is when they start going up the Missouri River, paddling up. And their first winter camp is up in the Dakotas at what they call Fort Mandan, because they wintered with the Mandan Indians, and they named their fort after it. This is on the high plains in 1804. Along the way, like I said, they bring with them, in addition to the core group of 33 guys, they bring with them Sacagawea, who accompanies her husband, an interpreter, a Frenchman named Charbonneau. And Sacagawea would prove incredibly useful for the journey, and Lewis and Clark acknowledged this in a variety of ways. Mostly, she proved to be useful in terms of interpreting Native American languages in the high plains and in the Rocky Mountains. Sacagawea, I guess, was originally Shoshone, and then as a young girl, she was stolen, kidnapped, sold away, something like that, to other tribes, eventually marrying Charbonneau, a white Frenchman. So she knew many different dialects and different Native American languages, and she knew French in a broken way because she communicated with her husband. She did not know English very well. Charbonneau knew a little bit of English, a little bit of, and he was fluent in French. So, I mean, the way this would happen is once Lewis and Clark and their men start going up into the northern plains, into the Rockies, when they would encounter Native Americans, there would be this like 3 or 4 way interpretive conversation going back and forth. So Sacagawea would begin to talk with some of the local Native Americans. She would translate their language, roughly, into French, broken French, who then she would tell that to Charbonneau, her husband, who would then translate that broken French into broken English and share it with Lewis and or Clark. And that's how these people made it all the way across and were able to communicate with many of the Native Americans. Now, it should be said, once the group crossed the mountains and went over to the Pacific Northwest, Sacagawea had no idea what those Native Americans were saying. She wasn't familiar with their language. But early on, it proved essential. Plus, William Clark wrote in his journal, he said that about Sacagawea. He says, quote, "The sight of this Indian woman convinced other Indians of our friendly intentions, as no woman ever accompanies a war party of Indians in this quarter." In other words, as long as they had Sacagawea with them, who, by the way, was either pregnant or carrying a newborn baby the entire way, hardcore. As long as they had Sacagawea with them and the Indians saw that, they knew, or they assumed, that Lewis and Clark and the expedition, they weren't a war party, they weren't out to cause violence. And that probably saved their necks more times than they even knew. and Clark acknowledges this, as does Lewis. Okay, so that's important. And it's a fascinating story in its own right, Sacagawea accompanying these guys out and showing them the way, basically, while caring for a newborn infant and literally carrying a newborn infant the entire way to the ocean, walking most of the way. It's crazy. One man died on the expedition, only one, which was quite amazing given all the trials and tribulations that they faced. And this guy was a Sergeant Floyd was his name, and he died of any number of ways he could have died. He died of something very simple, appendicitis. He grew really sick, his appendix ruptured, and they didn't have the ability, obviously, to do surgery or anything. And he died somewhere, I think, around modern-day Nebraska. He was buried. Other than that, every member of the expedition, including, of course, Sacagawea and her baby, and so on, they survived. It's an amazing thing to think about. Okay, they set off. Their first winter was with the Mandan Indians, which had... That tribe had recognized French and some American fur traders, and they dealt with them over time. And so it wasn't really a first encounter necessarily, although Lewis and Clark write a great deal about their experience with the Mandans. They stayed there the entire winter. One time they were treated to a feast. The Native Americans, the Mandans, gave them a big feast, sharing food and other things with them. And the main course, the fancy main course, were grilled or cooked puppies. Sounds awful. And Lewis and Clark would write about this in their journals, how shocked they were to see these little puppies that had been skinned and skewered and cooked over an open fire and served to the men. A lot of these rough, tumble, tough guy, mountain men types, they couldn't do it. They stood up and walked out into the cold instead of eating these little puppies. It's kind of brutal, but it was a delicacy among many Native Americans. And they tell lots of other stories about their time with the Mandans, very interesting. One of which I'll share with you. Lewis and Clark and their men, they kept hearing from Indian hunters and chiefs about the great yellow bear that lived a little bit further up the river as he got a little bit closer to western North Dakota and Montana. And they thought the Indians were making stuff up. Come on, they're exaggerating. They knew about black bears and so on, but they had no idea that anything like a grizzly bear existed. And so they kind of discounted the Mandans, saying, "Oh, come on. There must be some sort of a religion or something that you're talking about. This is a mythical bear." And they were soon to find out as they proceeded the next spring across into what is now Montana that the Mandans weren't making anything up. Indeed, the grizzly bear was there, and it was a great yellow-brown, basically, bear, and many of the guys would be chased. I'll show you some pictures in a minute. Be chased by these bears. Okay. They also, while they're meeting with Native Americans like the Mandans and future tribes as they go across the Pacific, they share with them different things. The expedition brought along these peace medals, like this one here has Jefferson's image on it and shaking hands, that they would give to the Native Americans to show that they meant peace and that they were now friends and so on. And Lewis famously brought along his air gun. This is essentially a early 19th century BB gun that Lewis was able to somehow, I don't know exactly how it worked based on the picture, but he was able to crank air, pressurized air, into the stock, the far side there, and in such a way that that pressurized air, when he pulled the trigger, would fire out a projectile, just like a BB gun, pellet gun. But this was fairly powerful, and it shot a bigger bullet than a typical little BB that we're all familiar with. And Lewis, if I said Jefferson earlier, I didn't mean it. Meriwether Lewis would demonstrate this on small game animals like rabbits and birds and so on, and it would kill them. And the Indians were they were shocked by this. They were familiar, the Indians were, with black powder weapons, the ones that made a big bang and so on. Some of the Indians had those. But here you have an air gun that made very little sound that downrange would kill a rabbit or a squirrel or a prairie dog. It was an amazing thing. So anyway, I think it's interesting. Lewis and Clark would share these trinkets and show off some of these items to for the Native Americans to establish diplomatic relations and so on, and to show that they're there in peace and they're looking around, exploring and so on. Interesting stuff. And you can see these things in museums. There's a really good museum in St. Louis, a good one out in Oregon and Washington about the expedition. Here's some scans of the journals. These are the actual journals kept by Lewis and Clark. On the far side, you see what their big boat looked like that they took up the Missouri River against the current. You see all the paddles and so on. Here's a random fish that they thought they needed to sketch out. Check out the detail, the description. These guys were very careful about what they were doing. Now, the whole time they're fighting against the weather and terrain and at some points Native Americans, yet they're keeping these beautiful, detailed journals. It's quite a feat. They're also fighting against bears. I find bears fascinating, and in fact, I'm trying to write a book on them in history. Overall, Bears in American History is my proposed title, and what I want to write a little bit about is sort of what these guys experience, tell some of these stories. And for example, after their visit with the Mandan, they begin to encounter grizzly bears. First, they see tracks in the mud along the riverbanks of the Missouri River that are way bigger than the black bear tracks they're accustomed to back east. And then they glimpse a few grizzlies at a great distance, and finally they send out some hunters to track one down. They're tired of barely seeing them and thinking about them and wondering about them. They actually want to go shoot one. So a group of hunters, 3 or 4 guys, go off after a bear, and they find it. The bear is feasting on a carcass, which is a bad time to interrupt the bear. And these guys go up there, not too spooked by it yet. They'd shot a lot of black bears in their day, and they all had guns. And a couple of the guys, they raise their rifles, point at the bear, and as the bear notices that they're there and begins to charge them, they fire. And they hit the bear. Both shots hit the bear in the neck and head area. It doesn't matter. The grizzly now is angry, it's wounded, and it keeps charging these guys. The other 2 fellows level their guns and shoot. Both bullets hitting the mark in the bear's face and head area. The big grizzly doesn't stop. And these guys, basically, these tough hunters, these mountain men who aren't afraid of anything, they are afraid of this bear. They turn around and start sprinting. Luckily for them, they're pretty close to the high bank of the Missouri River, and they literally jump over the high bank 10, 20 feet down into the water and begin to swim for their lives. The bear, wounded, mad, bloody, up on top, is looking down over the riverbank and decides not to jump in after them. These guys, they swim across the river, then soaking wet, missing their guns, all their powder's wet, their ammo's gone, their knives are gone. They basically walk back humiliated and embarrassed and terrified back to the camp where they're laughed at and they tell their story and so on. And a bunch of other guys go out this time ready for war, and they find the bear still alive, and they shoot it several more times until it's dead. I think in the end, I forget the exact numbers, but they found like 12 bullets inside this bear's head and area. Not all of them went into the brain. That would obviously incapacitate the bear, but grizzly bears have this really thick hide, a thick skull, and these musket balls just didn't have the power to penetrate that. And so basically they were just shooting the bear, and the bullets were getting lodged in its hide and its muscle. It's fatal eventually. The bear will bleed out, get infected, and die, but it's not going to stop it in its tracks like these guys were hoping for. After that, the fellows on the Lewis and Clark expedition had a renewed respect for these bears, and they feared grizzly attacks more than anything else during the entire expedition. And they say that themselves. They would post guards at night. Guys would stay up all night long on the perimeter of the camp to make sure there wasn't a bear in the vicinity. It terrified them. I mean, just like it would anybody. If you go out camping today in Yellowstone or something at night, you're going to be a little bit, if you're a normal human being, you're going to be a little bit creeped out that a big bear could come and rip into your tent and rip your head off at any moment. That was kind of what these guys were thinking. And when they were crossing the west, there were a lot more bears than there are now, to be sure. So there they are shooting at a bear. There's one guy being treed by a grizzly bear. It looks like a dog, but that's a grizzly bear treeing one of the hunters in the expedition. A couple things are wrong with this. First, the bear doesn't look like a bear; it looks like a dog. Second thing, the member of the expedition has a nice top hat on and a nice coat, which is that obviously wasn't happening at this point in the expedition. They were wearing leather, skins, moccasins, and so on. But anyway, it's interesting to see some of these contemporary sketches of the bears. Here is one. This is a bear claw necklace. Claws taken from bears killed by Indians and some of the members of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and this was presented to Thomas Jefferson after the expedition. Fascinating thing. You can still see this in museums. Okay, enough about bears for now. They get all the way, the expedition gets all the way to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains and realize then that they're going to have to cross these things. And they realize a couple other things, that there is no all-water route to the Pacific Ocean. That's obvious. In fact, they see several miles out, 50 miles out, they can see the white-capped, snow-peaked mountains in the distance, and they realize then there's no hope to find an all-water route. In fact, they're a little bit spooked about having to cross these mountains in the first place. And right around what is now Great Falls, Montana, there were a series of actual waterfalls. There's no waterfall in Great Falls anymore. That was done away with, but there were at the time. And this is where Lewis and Clark begin to dismantle their boats. They bury a lot of their supplies, and they prepare for their hike, basically, over the mountains to continue their journey. So they do this. They bury their supplies and they mark it in a subtle way, secretive way, so that they can disinter them on their return trip and put the boats back together. Pretty innovative. And then they move on into the mountains. And as they're walking, carrying their stuff, they encounter another Native American tribe. And this was intense at first. There were some standoffs. They would every now and then they'd catch a glimpse as they're in the foothills of the Rockies. They'd catch a glimpse of some Native American warriors watching them from a hilltop at a distance. And as soon as the expedition would make eye contact, basically the Indians would ride away. They were on horseback, would ride away. Kind of like from an old West film, Western flick. The same scenario. And the Lewis and Clark guys, they're a little bit worried about this. What are these guys up to? These Indians might come down and attack us. They could easily overwhelm the expedition. There's only 33 guys. And then once, toward the end of this back and forth, kind of spooky encounter with these Native Americans, Lewis and Clark and a small group run into another group of Native American warriors across a field. So they're on one side of a clearing. This is according to Lewis, I think, who wrote about it. Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and some others are on one side of a clearing. And on the other side is a bunch of Native American warriors armed, ready for combat. There's a very tense standoff as both sides kind of eye each other and try to figure out what's going on. Eventually, Lewis decides to take a chance and start walking by himself across the clearing, across the field toward the Indians. And he decides last minute to bring along Sacagawea for reasons I mentioned before. If he brought a woman with him, then maybe that would be a sign of peace, that he wasn't meaning to be of harm. So here go Lewis and Sacagawea walking across the field toward these Native American warriors. As they get closer and closer, Sacagawea begins, she thinks, to recognize some of these people. And then they get a little closer, and then she knows she recognizes at least one of the Indians, and she takes off. According to Lewis, she takes off in a sprint across to the Indians. At first, the Native American warriors are a little bit shocked by this. They're kind of backing up on their horses, getting their weapons ready, trying to figure out what's going on here. And then the person that Sacagawea recognizes her. She begins to yell out in the native language. These are the Shoshone Indians, her native people. And she had recognized her brother among the warriors. It's a great story. It's one of those that gives you little chills, kind of. And she recognizes her brother, who she hadn't seen since she was a little girl. And he recognizes her. They greet each other, and then Lewis walks across. Both sides meet up, and that saves the expedition, basically. Because these Shoshone Indians, were ready for war until Sacagawea recognizes her own brother. From then, the Shoshone help the expedition. They give them food, supplies, horses, and a guide. An old Shoshone Indian that the expedition nicknames Old Toby, that's kind of his nickname, was assigned to the expedition to show them the way across the rugged Rocky Mountains. And without Old Toby, there's a very good chance, I would say 90+% chance, that the expedition would not have made it across the mountains. At least they wouldn't have made it alive. They would have died somewhere along the way. As it was, even with Old Toby, they nearly died, as we'll see. All right, so there again, Sacagawea, her connection with the Shoshone, led to Old Toby, supplies, horses, and so on, that would keep the expedition alive across the Rocky Mountains. Without Sacagawea, they probably all would have died. It's interesting and important. Okay, so they cross the Rocky Mountains right along what is now called the Bitterroot Range, very tough terrain. Old Toby showing them the way. The Bitterroots go from western Montana across the neck of Idaho that sticks up, and you can drive a road through there today, and it's just really rugged. Hard to believe these guys were able to get across it, even on horseback. About the time that they started getting to the top of the Bitterroot and working their way down, they run out of food. They had to kill most of their horses to eat the horses. At the end, they were chewing on pieces of leather just to have something in their mouths. They were slowly starving to death. And finally, they were able to make it down to the west side of the Rocky Mountains, down into the Snake River Valley, where they got on the Snake River, built some canoes really quick, got on the Snake River, and floated into the Columbia River, where they began to move toward the ocean. It was in this region that they encountered another Native American tribe. After saying goodbye to Old Toby, he had to walk all the way back across the mountains. The expedition encountered the Nez Perce Indians. The Nez Perce Indians, a very famous tribe that would be in the picture again in the 1870s, Chief Joseph in the Nez Perce War. At this time, the Nez Perce initially greeted the expedition cautiously, and Lewis and Clark would later find out that the chiefs among the Nez Perce met in secrecy right after seeing the expedition members to determine what should happen. There were several different chiefs of the Nez Perce Nation. They met and argued about what to do with these guys. One of the options was kill them all. And they voted on it. And according to Lewis and Clark in their journals, they found this out later. They talked with some people. They survived by maybe 1 or 2 votes. It was that close. It was the vote went to kill them all or help them. I mean, there wasn't really much middle ground there. And they voted by 1 or 2 votes to help them instead of kill them, which is, again, a good thing. And so the Nez Perce gave them canoes, food, and so on. Most of the food at this point was dried salmon. Salmon was the main food source among the Pacific Northwest Indians. And Lewis and Clark and the expedition got in their new canoes with their salmon, dried salmon, like salmon jerky, and floated now downriver, down the Columbia River, toward the Pacific Ocean. Here's a pretty cool painting of them in their canoes, encountering some Indians, Nez Perce and others, along the Columbia. The Columbia River Gorge is a beautiful stretch that separates Washington and Oregon today. And the gorge was literally gorged out due to a massive volcanic eruption way back, I don't remember, it's thousands of years ago, from a volcano that sat where modern-day Yellowstone is. If you've ever been to Yellowstone, or if you know anything about it, you know all the geysers and the paint pots and all this kind of stuff, the lava-type activity, volcanic activity beneath the surface, that's the same volcano. And thousands and thousands of years ago, that volcano was the typical-looking big volcano, and it blew. And it was so powerful that it shot these pyroclastic flows, I think is what they call them, and including rupturing basically an earthen dam, a natural earthen dam of this huge lake, as big as one of the Great Lakes that was around the Yellowstone area. And so between the pyroclastic flows and this massive volume of water that was pouring out of this burst dam of this huge deep lake, the water had to go somewhere, and it literally scraped out the Columbia River Gorge all the way from Montana. It's crazy. And they know this because they found boulders and rocks all the way down in Oregon and Washington that could only have originated in Montana at Yellowstone. Crazy. Anyway, that's got a little on a tangent there, but it was down this gorge that was carved out by this ancient volcanic blast and a lake that drained out that Lewis and Clark floated down in 1804, 1805 to the ocean. Once they got to the ocean, some of them went out and actually saw the Pacific Ocean. Most of them stayed a little bit up the river in this, what they call Fort Clatsop. The words are cut off there a little bit, but it's C-L-A-T-S-O-P. This is a recreated fort. The original Fort Clatsop doesn't exist anymore. But if you go there today, it's right next to or in Astoria, Oregon. Beautiful little town. You can go out to the park and you can walk around in this fort, which was built on the same site of the original Fort Clatsop. It's really neat. That's where they spent their second winter out on the coast, living in the rain and the cold of the Pacific Northwest. And most of the guys didn't like it much. It's beautiful, huge trees, cool weather, very green. Even in the winter, it's pretty green out there. It's a neat environment, but when you don't have coffee shops on every corner and neat bookstores and all this kind of stuff to go visit, like you now do out in the Pacific Northwest, thinking Portland and Seattle, then it's pretty miserable. These guys were constantly wet. Their leather clothes were mildewy and shrinking on them, and they had the only thing they really ate for the entire winter were two things, with few exceptions. They had boiled elk meat, sounds awful, and dried salmon. And that's what they ate, basically. And they were hard-pressed to find much else. So they were ready. By the next spring, they were ready in 1806 to get back. And they went back up the Columbia River, crossed the mountains. This time it all went a little more smoothly. And were able to go back down the Missouri River rapidly on their way back. I'm going to take you to a map really quick here. Here we go. Oops. On the way back, the expedition split up. Some of the guys went with Clark and explored. You see there in the loop, the red loop that goes down a little bit, explored the northern sections very near of where Yellowstone National Park is. They didn't get into the national park itself. The national park obviously wasn't as such then. They didn't get into what is now Yellowstone. They came very close. Lewis, meanwhile, took another group of guys further north. He's the darker line that goes up north, and you see there at the end where there's kind of a loop where he goes up and he turns back around and comes back down the way he came. That's one of the more interesting stories of the return trip. Lewis and his group of guys went up to explore some of the mountain ranges near what is now Glacier National Park in northwestern Montana. Beautiful, rugged area. A lot of bears there, too. And that's where they encountered for the first time the Blackfeet Indians, which were notorious for hating Americans or any white people coming into their territory. And one night, according to Lewis, his men were camped out and they heard some commotion. And some of their horses were being stolen in the middle of the night by Blackfoot warriors. And confusion kind of broke out, and everybody was yelling, trying to save their horses. And shots were fired suddenly in the darkness. Some of Lewis's men were shooting at the Blackfeet Indians, but they couldn't see it very well. You know, it was only moonlight, basically. And one of the guys who had bad eyesight anyway, according to Lewis, mistook Lewis for an Indian when Lewis was getting up, running around himself, and shot Lewis. Meriwether Lewis was shot on his own expedition. And he shot him right in the tail end, basically. Basically, Lewis he got shot in the ass. And, you know, he was embarrassed, and he fell down. He was screaming, bleeding. And this guy who shot him, you know, obviously was mortified when he figured out what had happened. And the Indians made away with, I think they got away with a couple of the horses, and a couple of the Indians were shot and killed, actually, too. But some of the Indians were able to get away to report back to the main village. And here was Lewis, shot, holding his tail end the entire time, bleeding, mortified. He was a very formal kind of guy, and as a leader and so on. And this was the most embarrassing accident that could possibly have happened. Not to mention he was in a lot of pain. And some of the horses that remained, his men threw Lewis up onto his stomach, across the saddle, basically. He couldn't sit down. And then they fled on horseback. Not the survivors, they all survived, but the men got the heck out of there as quick as possible, knowing full well that the Blackfoot warriors would be chasing them very soon. So they were running for their lives. And so anyway, I say all that to say that right there where that loop is right around where Lewis got shot in the ass by his own men who were trying to shoot the Blackfeet Indians. And they make it back safely, join up with Clark and his men. Lewis embarrassingly has to tell what happened, and for the entire rest of the journey back down the Missouri River, when Lewis should have been celebrating this mostly successful expedition, he was laying down on his stomach trying to allow himself to heal. It was a mortifying thing for the guy, and for the guy who shot him too. Anyway, they make it back safe and sound all the way back to St. Louis, which is right here. I feel like a weatherman on this thing. And to celebrations, parades. This was huge. A lot of the Americans had given these guys up for dead because it had taken so long and they hadn't been in contact for a couple years. And Jefferson was delighted to hear that they had made it back. And only one man had died, Sergeant Floyd. And the journals were meant to be published. Lewis was going to try to publish these journals the whole time, but he got bogged down into it. He suffered from depression, clinical depression, basically, and ultimately was not able to finish the job. In fact, a few years after the expedition, it's kind of sad, he was traveling down the Natchez Trace, a beautiful stretch of road down through Mississippi to New Orleans, stopped at a little lodge overnight, and the lodge owner heard a gunshot in Lewis's room, ran in, opened the door, and found Meriwether Lewis slumped over. He had shot himself, killed himself, due to this depression and so on. So the journals of Lewis and Clark were never really published and made available until much, much later into the 20th century. Now we have the great ability to access all of them, full text, online, like I said, at the University of Nebraska website. So that's the expedition. What did they succeed? What did they do? Well, they didn't find an all-water route to the Pacific, but they did make contact with numerous Native American tribes, civilizations. They mapped out a huge expanse of land. They gave America in this critical time period hope, basically. And it gave America a direction, that is, west, to focus its energy on, a new westward-focused identity emerged, thanks in large part to the Lewis and Clark expedition. Good maps, Native American contact, and a ton of excellent detail about the plants and animals in the Rocky Mountain West. Great stuff. And at the time, this was the first time any of these animals and plants had been written about. So those are the accomplishments, and the consequences are far-reaching, though, in terms of, again, American identity and expansion and so on. I'm almost finished with this video, but I want to talk about a few other excuse me, small expeditions first. I won't spend nearly as much time, but I don't want to ignore these entirely like they've been ignored in most history books. At the same time that Jefferson ordered Lewis and Clark to go out and explore the big chunk, the northern sections of the Louisiana Purchase, he also ordered George Hunter and William Dunbar to put together a small expedition of about 19 men to explore what is now Arkansas, which is interesting. Not nearly as epic and not as, interesting in terms of everything that they would see, but the Hunter and Dunbar expedition, as it was known, gives us some incredible insight into early Arkansas, especially the Hot Springs area, if you've been up there. I'm given to understand East Texans like to go on vacation sometimes to Hot Springs, Arkansas, explore the Ouachita Mountains. Hunter and Dunbar were the first Americans in their expedition to go in and explore this area. In fact, Jefferson had heard from French explorers and so on about this fabled hot springs, these mineral waters that were supposed to heal people, which was hot springs. And he ordered Hunter and Dunbar to go up on this expedition and explore this area. So their expedition goes up the Ouachita River, I think, up into the Ouachita Mountains to Hot Springs, and they have their journals. Their journals are published now. You can read about them and what they experience, and they write about animals and plants and the mountains and all of southern Arkansas, which is really fascinating. They write about seeing bears and mountain lions and wolves and even some mountain bison. So buffalo used to live in Arkansas, believe it or not, which is pretty neat. And so this expedition filled in a gap in the Arkansas section of the Louisiana Purchase. It's kind of interesting. Then there was another one, also ordered by Jefferson. This becomes known as the Freeman and Custis Expedition, also known as the Red River Expedition. Their job was to explore the Red River, the southern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. They had hoped, they had planned to go all the way up to the headwaters of the Red River, which would have taken them out all the way out to the Texas Panhandle and up into New Mexico and beyond. But they explored the Red River in Louisiana, which was important, and they write about what they found in their journals. and their expedition has been written about quite a bit by historians. But by the time they get up to what is now Texarkana, not far from here, they ran into a Spanish patrol, which is interesting because the Spanish, they never really agreed to the Louisiana Purchase. They never really had any control over Napoleon selling this land, and they always considered Louisiana to be still part of the Spanish Empire. And so there were armed Spanish patrols out riding around looking for Americans, looking for Lewis and Clark, looking for Hunter and Dunbar, and in this case, looking for Freeman and Custis. The only expedition they found, well, one of the only expeditions they found was the Freeman and Custis. And they found them right around modern-day Texarkana. And there was a tense standoff between Freeman and Custis's men and this Spanish patrol, this cavalry patrol, basically. And ultimately, Freeman and Custis backed down. They left, went back into Louisiana, and reported to American authorities what had happened. So their expedition was cut short. And it led to a potential international crisis. And Jefferson was prepared, potentially, to fight against the Spanish officials down in Texas and this area over this Louisiana Purchase territory. But we never did quite come to blows just yet over the issue. One more quick expedition to talk about. It's a great story, fascinating history. and that's the Pike expedition of 1806. Zebulon Pike, a well-known, successful military officer, led another expedition to explore the southwestern boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase. And they brought a pretty good number of guys with them. They cut across the Great Plains straight toward Colorado, modern-day Colorado. And as you can guess, Zebulon Pike was the first American to explore the region around Colorado Springs. And, of course, the big mountain overlooking Colorado Springs bears his name, Pike's Peak. He actually tries to climb to the top of the mountain. I don't think he makes it to the top of his own namesake mountain, but that's where we get Pike's Peak. Anyway, Pike's expedition puts on the map for the United States most of Colorado and northern New Mexico in that area, the headwaters of the Rio Grande and parts of the Red River and so on. And eventually, though, there's some intrigue tied into this and some diplomacy and potential warfare, too. Right around the time that Pike and his men went south from Pike's Peak, down toward the headwaters of the Rio Grande in what is now south-central Colorado, near modern-day Pagosa Springs, if you're familiar with the state. He was captured by Spanish cavalry patrol, right? And his entire expedition was captured, taken prisoner, and they, as you can see on the map, they were marched down through New Mexico into Mexico proper and put in prison temporarily. And this was a big deal. Eventually, he was released under pressure from the United States. He and his men were released and were able to go back and rejoin. But a lot of their maps and their journals and so on were lost, unfortunately, were taken by the Spanish authorities, which is too bad for us historians. Now, the intrigue associated with Pike's expedition is a fascinating little story. James Wilkinson, a powerful general in the American Army in this time period, had supposedly conspired with Aaron Burr, the guy who shot Alexander Hamilton in the famous duel, to send along agents with Zebulon Pike to map out a region in this chunk of America that they could carve out into an independent, separate nation from the United States. So Wilkinson and Aaron Burr, two guys who had pretty much spurned and hated the current administration in many respects. Well, Burr didn't necessarily hate Jefferson, but they had a falling out. They wanted to carve out their own nation out west, and which is this is treason, basically. Pike probably had no idea that there were these secret agents as part of his expedition. And word of this would leak later on after Pike got back. And Wilkinson and Burr would be put on trial for treason for doing this, for attempting to carve out their own nation out west. I don't remember exactly how the trial turns out. They weren't executed or anything, but they were punished for their attempt. Anyway, I talk about all these other expeditions mostly to put Lewis and Clark in context and also to give you a sense of what Jefferson and the United States was thinking with regards to this new chunk of territory and expansion. Jefferson was acutely interested in figuring out what exactly he just bought from Napoleon. And all these expeditions, in their own way, would help fill in the gaps, would basically put this place on a map. But I think, again, if you take all of these and add them together, Lewis and Clark being the most famous for sure, if you take all of these and put them together, the most important consequence of all of this, of all these expeditions, is it gives the United States a sense of direction, an identity and a sense of direction. And that direction and identity is based squarely on the western half of the continent. And that would be the American, the white American identity from the early 1800s all the way up to the 1890s, if you think about it. The West was where it was. We'd have a fur trade, which we'll talk about next time, the mountain men era, and then the Indian Wars and the mining towns popping up throughout the Rockies, and then the gold rush in the 1840s in California, the Oregon Trail in the 1840s. All these things would pop up, again, creating a very unique United States of America. And these early expeditions, these early explorations proved critical in sort of promoting this region for the rest of America, which I think is very important. All right, I'm going to be quiet with that, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.